Disaster Recovery Project Manager with IADA, and I will be the new Section 3 subject matter expert as we roll out this brand new rule. Just a reminder to myself to record the meeting, which it is, so great. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with Microsoft Teams, but here's a few pointers as we go through this presentation. If you can submit chats to the chat box through clicking the little chat box. It kind of looks like the WhatsApp logo there. If you want to raise your hand, you can press the hand raising thing, and we will use that more towards the question and answer segment at the end. There's your camera feature. Please keep your cameras turned off. It looks kind of weird when you view the recording later and you can kind of see what people are up to. Please keep yourself muted as well until you're called upon. That just ensures the quality of the audio. And if you do have any questions, feel free to email me, and my email address is down there. And looking at the chat box feature for some technical assistance here, that's what it looks like. Pretty similar to what Facebook Messenger would look like if you're used to using that. But if you want to send a personal question or something more related to a specific case, feel free to email me and we will respond after the event. So what is Section 3? Section 3 is a provision of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 that is applicable to CDBG funded projects. And if you want to view the rule in its entirety, you can do so at 24 CFR Part 75. Section 3 encourages the employment of low-income persons, preferably low-income persons that reside in the local area in HUD-funded projects. Its intention is so that low-income persons may gain professional skills that lead to long-term employment, extends employment opportunities to nearby low-income residents, and to maximize the benefits of the federal investment to the community. Previously, CDBG grant administrators, like most of you on the call, submitted annual reports on the number of new hires for Section 3 compliance to Iowa grants. This is no longer going to be the procedure. Section 3 will now be tracking labor hours instead of new hires, and more details will follow in this presentation. We'll have a similar policy of uploading something to Iowa grants, and we are still working through that at this time. HUD updated the Section 3 rule last year, and this will come into effect on July 1st, 2021 for applicable IDA awarded projects. Projects that are subject to this new rule include projects that are awarded after July 1st and projects that have not launched bids or entered into construction contracts until after July 1st, and those projects that receive at least $200,000 in CDBG funds. Section 3 applies to housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and other public construction projects. It does not apply to materials-only contracts. It applies when you are receiving at least $200,000 in CDBG funds. And this will apply to relevant awards in the following IDA CDBG programs. It'll apply for disaster recovery programs, and when it's a new housing project, when a specific project receives at least $200,000 and not the overall community award. It'll apply for community facilities and services, downtown revitalization, again, when a specific owner receives at least $200,000, not the overall community award. Upper story housing, which is again the similar procedure. Water and sewer, opportunities and threats, and COVID when construction is involved and receives at least $200,000. So as I said earlier, Section 3 will now track labor hours instead of new hires. This is intended so that it may provide a more beneficial long-term employment opportunities to lower-income people than the prior new hires rule provided. So what does this look like? Well, at least 25% of total project hours should be worked by Section 3 workers, and at least 5% of total project hours should be worked by targeted Section 3 workers. So if you can meet these 25% and 5% safe harbor benchmarks, then the project is considered to have complied with Section 3. But if not, qualitative efforts can ensure compliance. Now, I know this is a little bit confusing, so I tried to rephrase it here. You'd have at least 20% minimum by Section 3 workers of any type, plus 5% minimum by targeted Section 3 workers. So that's what the 25% and 5% are intended to mean. It's important to note that the tracking of labor hours for Section 3 applies even if the project does not have to comply with Davis-Bacon. All hours on the project should be tracked, not just Section 3 workers. You need to get the total labor hours for Section 3 workers for all workers, so all hours need to be tracked. Hours should be tracked by the contractors and grant administrator as the project is underway and will be reported to IEDA at the conclusion of the project. And our monitoring will include Section 3. And we will be providing templates to guide the tracking of labor hours on Section 3 projects, and we will go over a few of those tools later on in this presentation. So if a safe harbor benchmark, which is the 25% and 5%, cannot be met, the following are examples of activities that could be done to ensure compliance. You can do outreach efforts to generate targeted Section 3 workers, provide technical assistance to help Section 3 workers, such as resume assistance, hold job fairs between Section 3 workers and eligible employers. You can provide assistance to help Section 3 workers apply for vocational training, education, etc. Can engage in business outreach to identify and secure bids from Section 3 business concerns. You can advertise for jobs online and in circulations that reach Section 3 workers. You can provide training or apprenticeship opportunities. You can use service providers to connect Section 3 employees with employers. You can refer Section 3 workers to services that help with work readiness and retention. You can provide financial literacy training to Section 3 workers. You can provide technical assistance to Section 3 businesses to encourage them applying for these opportunities. And you can promote the use of the Section 3 Business Registry and HUD Opportunity Portal. If you are using qualitative efforts to demonstrate compliance, it's essential to maintain documentation of these efforts, which includes retaining copies of direct mail solicitations, copies of email and outreach efforts, copies of formal job advertisements, copies of flyers or online ads about meetings, job trainings, etc., copies of sign-in lists from job fairs, and agendas and our meeting notes from meetings with contractors. It's much clearer to meet the labor hour benchmarks than using these qualitative efforts. We at IDA are still determining whether qualitative efforts will be best conducted at the state, local, or coordinated at both levels to ensure compliance with Section 3. Some of these efforts would be burdensome on grant administrators, while some are best handled with personal knowledge of the local conditions. We are looking for feedback from you on what your capacities are and how to best implement qualitative compliance efforts. So getting into the definitions here, Section 3 worker definition here, 25% of project hours should be completed by Section 3 workers. These individuals must meet one or more of the following criteria within the past 5 years. So looking back today, 5 years. Low-income person for the prior annualized calendar year, which we are looking at or below 80% of the individual area median income to be considered low income. Now, one of the quirky nuances of this rule is we only look at one person household income. So they could live in one person household or live in a 5-person household. We're looking at what the one person household income figures are. They could be employed by Section 3 business, or they could be a current youth build participant. I provided below some examples of what the 80% one-person income looked like for counties across the state. You can see it tends to be in the low to mid $40,000 range. Going into targeted Section 3 workers, 5% of a project's labor hours must be done by targeted Section 3 workers. These workers meet the criteria we described above, but have a few more requirements. For CDBG projects, this includes the following. They're a worker that is employed by Section 3 business, or they're a worker who currently or when hired within the past 5 years was verified to live within the service area of the project or are a current youth build participant. Now, a project service area is defined as within 1 mile of the project site, or if fewer than 5,000 people live within 1 mile, then a radius of the project site that encompasses 5,000 people. Now, HUD does plan to release an online tool to help you calculate this, and we'll let you know when it's available. But in the meantime, use existing data to demonstrate this as best as you can. Looking into what a Section 3 business is, Section 3 business must meet one or more of the following criteria. They're a business that is at least 51% owned by low-income persons. They're 75% of their labor hours over the prior 3 months were performed by Section 3 workers or youth build participants, or their business that is at least 51% owned by current residents of public housing or Section 8 assisted housing. Now, businesses can complete a self-certification form to be registered as a Section 3 business, and they can register at the link below on the HUD Opportunity portal. Looking into recipient responsibilities, recipients or grant administrators are required to verify and document the hours of Section 3 workers, track all labor hours on the project, including by non-Section 3 workers, document evidence of these hours, and document any qualitative efforts taken to comply with Section 3. Penalties for non-compliance do include sanctions from HUD, termination of contract for CDBG funds, and debarment or suspension from future HUD-assisted contracts. Now, these penalties primarily apply to IEDA, but if you all don't comply, then we don't comply, and we all will suffer the consequences. Each recipient or grant administrator has the responsibility to comply with Section 3 and ensure its contractors or subcontractors are in compliance. This includes, but is not limited to, documenting efforts taken to comply with this requirement and any impediments to doing so. Implementing procedures designed to notify Section 3 workers about training and employment opportunities, facilitating training and employment of Section 3 employees and award of contracts to Section 3 businesses, and notifying potential contractors of Section 3 requirements, incorporating Section 3 compliance language in all solicitations and contracts covered by Section 3, and actively cooperating with compliance and refraining from entering into any contract with any contractor who has been found in violation of Section 3. Recipients or grant administrators are required, to the greatest extent feasible, to facilitate contracts with Section 3 businesses. This means going above and beyond normal procedures, such as reaching out to Section 3 HUD Opportunity Portal registrants and/or specifically reaching out to eligible businesses when opportunities arise. Iowa procurement requirements do require recipients to select the lowest responsible bidder under a competitive sealed process, but recipients may give preference to Section 3 businesses under the evaluation criteria when reviewing professional service contracts. All businesses must demonstrate that they are responsible and able to perform under the terms and conditions of proposed contracts. Contractors are not required to hire workers specifically to meet Section 3 requirements. If existing employees meet the criteria or had met it within the past 5 years, they can be counted. Recipients, contractors, and subcontractors are required to give preference to Section 3 workers to the greatest extent feasible when employment and training opportunities result from a CDBG project. Contractors and subcontractors should work with the grant administrator to advertise opportunities to Section 3 workers. Notices of employment or training should be sent to the president of the Iowa chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, and there is the hyperlink to their contact information. Employment priority should be given to Section 3 workers in the service area, followed by youth build participants, and then by other Section 3 workers. Now we're going to get into some templates here to help guide your reporting of Section 3. Starting up first is a worker certification form. This is a form that we will be using to certify someone as being a Section 3 worker. Looking at what you guys will do first, grant administrators will enter the 80% one-person household figure for the project area, and we'll provide a link to where you can get that information in a future slide. If a person checks that they're income eligible, you will verify their address to see if they qualify as a targeted Section 3 worker. And then you also will review the submitted income verification documents. Looking at what the workers will do, they will write their name, they'll write their community name, or they're pretty much where they live. They'll check if their income was at or below the limit that you provided. And if their income is at that or below that, we'll look at the next steps, which are they will write their permanent address. They will check and attach which verifying documentation that they're providing to show their income, and they will sign and date the form. Looking at businesses, as we said earlier, businesses can self-certify if they are a Section 3 business. They'll complete this form to the left. It's a one-page form, and they will return it to the grant administrator. An IDA considers this form adequate documentation of Section 3 compliance. So looking at the labor hours worksheet template, which we will go into this in more detail in the next slides, but this is what an example of this labor hours worksheet will look like. So you as grant administrators will start by typing in the project name, the project address, and the project start date on the first tab of the Excel sheet. You'll then move to the second tab to type in the income limits. So you'll type in the area, 80% area median income for a one-person household for the project area. And as we said before, it doesn't matter what household size a person has. The way Section 3 is worded, we look at individual income, which is the one-person household income. So we will only put that figure in as the income threshold. And you can see the following link there to get the income limits for fiscal year 2021. Going back to the first sheet, which is the main sheet of the Excel, you'll type in their ID, which is their name or some other identifier. You'll type in the work week. You'll type in the number of hours that they had for that week. You'll type in their initial date of hire. Now, this is because Section 3 looks back 5 years. We need to see if they are employed, within the past 5 years or later to see if they qualify as a Section 3 worker. You'll type in an hourly rate of pay at the time of hire. You'll look at what their currently hourly rate is. And then you'll type in whether or not they're a targeted Section 3 worker based on your own, verification of their address or other criteria. Once you fill all of that out, this form has quite a bit of formulas and calculations to help you calculate the number of hours in Section 3 hours that are worked. This form will automatically add up the sum of labor hours that were worked. It will add up the sum of Section 3 hours worked, and that is based upon a person's date of hire and their wage rates. And this will add up the sum of the targeted Section 3 hours worked based on your input if they were a targeted worker or not. And then it will calculate the percentages for Section 3 and targeted. So you can see here, based on this example, we had 40% of our labor hours were by Section 3 workers. These were people who may have had pay increases over time or were recently hired. And it shows, kind of looking back 5 years, what that means for some projects. And you can see the targeted Section 3 hours, which carries over from Section 3 hours worked if that person was indicated to meet the criteria. Looking at the final tab of the Excel sheet, this will be a qualitative outreach efforts form. All recipients should complete this, even if you have already met the labor hours requirement. And you will print and sign, complete and upload this to Iowa Grants at the conclusion of the project, along with other documentation that we're still working on creating the form for. So looking in summary, Section 3 now requires the tracking of labor hours for projects awarded at least $200,000 in CDBG funds that involved rehabilitation, housing construction, and other public construction. At least 25% of labor hours should be worked by Section 3 workers. That's at least 20% by Section 3 workers overall, at least 5% by targeted Section 3 workers. And you can use qualitative efforts to comply even if this cannot be met. And this applies even when a project is not subject to Davis-Bacon. IDA will begin requiring Section 3 compliance on July 1st, which is next Thursday, if a project is awarded after July 1st and construction is out for bid after July 1st, and if the award amount is $200,000 or more. So with that, I will turn this back over to Nicole and Ann, and we will answer your questions at this time.
Great, Stephen. Thank you very much. I've got the chat open, and we did get a couple of questions through that. So we'll go through those questions first, and then we can allow folks to unmute after that. So the first question from Myrtle Nelson: for upper story applicability of Section 3, please define what is meant by specific housing project. Is the 200,000 threshold per apartment unit or per the apartment building? So it's by project, and project is defined in Section 3 rule by location and ownership. So because upper story is conversion, it really doesn't matter how many units are being created. It's a single construction contract at a single location with single ownership. So the construction and the CDBG award to that project exceeds 200,000, then Section 3 is applicable. Stephen, do you have any other follow-up, or Myrtle, do you have any follow-up on that question?
No, I think that describes it pretty thoroughly.
All right, Nicole Moore asked if the presentation was available for print off, and I did respond in chat that it is not posted at this time, but we intend to post both the slides and the recording of this presentation for your reference after the fact, as Nicole mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Alexis provided a chat that says partnering with local community colleges perhaps is a good effort for training and outreach efforts. I think that's a great suggestion when we get to those qualitative measures when we don't meet our benchmark. So we'll keep that in mind as a note. And then the last question, and Rose, I completely agree with you. Rose wrote, if a laborer makes less than the 80% AMI for their county, but they are married to a doctor, they are still a Section 3 worker. And the answer is yes. This is where the Section 3 new rule, when it came out, used terminology that is not necessarily consistent with how other CDBG programs are managed. Generally, when we talk about 80% area median income, it's household based, and that is what HUD publishes. But the rule specifically says 80% of the individual area median income. Well, HUD does not publish an individual area median income. So we have taken the understanding and the determination that a one-person household is equal to an individual area median income. All right, that's all the questions in the chat. I think we should probably use the raise hand feature if folks want to unmute and ask, and Steve and I can monitor the participant list if I can see them all. So if anyone wants to ask another question, please select raise hand, or you can type it into the chat. I'm not seeing any at this time. So Rose said we may need to update the certification form. So the certification form that Stephen just presented, or the certification form that you're currently using? And I think the reason I ask is that our understanding, and we've got some, the one Stephen showed, it references household. Well, that's because the only way to get that information from HUD is using the household information. So it says household, but then it says enter it for a one-person household. We can look to make sure that we're consistent, but the HUD doesn't publish an individual income. So we have to use household income, and it has to be a one-person household to get to an individual income level. I hope that's making sense. Okay, it looks like maybe we might have a raised hand. Tom, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure, can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Okay, so just to make sure to verify someone qualifies as a Section 3, we would need documentation of past income.
So if they were hired within the past 5 years, and within the past 5 years qualified as a Section 3 worker, the spreadsheet tries to capture that by asking the date of hire and the income at the time of hire. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yes, so you'll just need documentation of what their income was within the past 5 years. If they qualify as Section 3, whether it's like a tax return statement or something of that sort.
So I guess has HUD put out any estimates of like what kind of additional administrative time that's going to put on contractors to kind of comply with these requirements?
So to be perfectly honest, we have raised that question many times. I'm sure many people on this call recall when we reached out to all of our partners. Gosh, I think, Nicole, it's probably been 2 years ago when the draft rule was presented, and we collectively put together comments, frankly, in opposition of the proposed rule because of that administrative burden. And HUD spent about a year reviewing them, or maybe 18 months, and then provided, if you go look at the new rule link, there's about 100 pages of rebuttal to all of the negative comments they received. And every HUD representative I've spoken to is defiantly set on the fact that this will not create an administrative burden, despite all of the things we have told them.
Right. This is Nicole to elaborate a little bit on Ann's comments. The assumption from HUD has been, well, these projects are already tracking hours due to Davis-Bacon, so this really isn't any additional work. But as Ann and I have brought up several times to several different folks at HUD, that's not accurate. There are projects where Section 3 applies where Davis-Bacon would not. And I feel like those are going to be the most impacted in terms of time and work. I do think it will be easier when there is a project where you're collecting payrolls and they have those Davis-Bacon requirements, but it's been very challenging to get HUD staff to understand that not every project is collecting Davis-Bacon information because they're not required to, but now they are going to be required to provide this information. That being said, whether or not we agree with it, quite frankly, is a moot point. The rule is what it is, and we submitted comments, to try to voice our objections, but the rule changed. So at this point, all of us just have to comply with it. We are certainly, trying to clarify things with HUD to the best of our ability. And when we can do that, we will certainly share that, with all of you as we get more guidance. We're actually in the process of updating the management guide now. And that whole chapter on Section 3 will be updated to reflect the new rule. We've been working with a consultant to help us develop some of these tools that hopefully, you find helpful and make your lives easier. And if there are things that, we can provide, as you get into this, please let us know. I agree. I'm seeing comments that, contractors are not going to love this. No, they're not. But it is where we're at, and we do have to comply. And, we're certainly here to, again, help you maneuver this rule as we try to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I would just say, Brad, Diana, Shirley, Jeremy, the contractor concern, and frankly, the assumption I have that contractors are already not bidding on our projects because of the overburdensome regulation, and this just makes it worse. I have voiced that to HUD, and I think we don't have a formal process right now of having you all, notate that. But what I can just ask is that, HUD is only going to listen if and when we have evidence to support the claims that we're making. And so if you start to see a lack of response in bidding, or have some way to, collect records or memos locally that says nobody bid on this because the process was overly burdensome, I think the more that we can have data to support our position, the better we are. So I agree that contractors likely will stop bidding on small projects if it's not in their effort to keep track of this. There was a question about clarifying it for housing rehab. So this is something that we can be very clear on, is that the 200,000 threshold is limited to when ownership and location of the project are the same. So just because a community gets $200,000 to do 5 or 6 individual housing rehabs, those individual properties are not owned by the same person, and the construction contract is not taking place at the same location. So typically, and that's kind of why owner occupied rehab was not on the slide Stephen presented about, typically when this will be triggered. Upper story housing, it will, as we mentioned earlier, because that's generally single ownership, single project, single construction contract. But for housing rehab, it is very unlikely that that will be triggered. And the same is true for DTR, except for the rare circumstances where a facade program might have one critical building that all the funds are going to, or a situation where an owner owns multiple connected storefronts that exceed that trigger. I hope that answers your question, Shirley.
Is it all right if I ask a follow-on question?
Yes, sorry,
previous
Tom.
one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to go through comments and raised hands at the same time. And I think that Rose also had her hand raised. So Tom, you go ahead, go first.
Yeah. So like a lot of times when I do a labor interview, it's not uncommon for laborers to not even be entirely sure what they're getting paid right now. So I'm guessing they probably don't have really good documentation of their income from previous employment. So in that case, is it just going to kind of be a situation where they might be a Section 3 worker, but we can't confirm that, and then we just track those as regular hours and have to look at those qualitative methods for compliance?
So I think, unlike Davis-Bacon, this regulation does not necessarily have that sort of labor interview process involved. This is kind of more like when the project starts, the contractor is going to have all of his laborers or her laborers fill out this form and submit it kind of with, you know, the initial project kickoff. And Stephen, you can jump in if I'm wrong, but the thought is kind of just establish who's working on the project, what their hourly rate is, what their rate was at hire. We're hoping that a lot of that can be provided by the contractor and then signed by the laborer. So it's less like just approaching someone on the job site, and it's more like just verification from the contractor. Now, I think Dan Harbour is on vacation this week, but we know that all those interviews and the Copeland anti-kickback and all the regulations a part of labor standards are there because the federal government doesn't really want to trust the contractor. But for this Section 3 rule, that's kind of the direction that we've been told to go with our guidance. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think in terms of looking at their income currently or in the past, you know, if their current income meets Section 3 requirements, then they qualify. They don't have to have met it 5 years ago. We're just the 5-year look back is just there in case a worker doesn't qualify now, but they may have in the recent past. So if they have current documentation of their income, I would think that's sufficient.
All right, Rose, do you want to unmute and ask your question? It looks like you're still muted, Rose. Maybe you put it in the chat and you don't need to ask. I don't know. While Rose works it out, it looks like Ed has his hand raised. Ed, do you want to ask a question?
Well, I just was going to make one comment for all the people working on DTRs. Be careful that, you know, you might think, well, we're not going to spend $200,000 on one single building unless it's iconic application. But you often see one owner that might have three buildings, maybe even more in the project, and those would aggregate. So beware that if we have one owner that receives more than 200,000 towards their buildings, this would apply. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we're going to have a bit of a hard time splicing that, and we need to think more about how that works in terms of same ownership, same address. I think we need to contemplate that a little more.
One question that popped into my mind, maybe other people as well. When you say 200,000, is that CDBG dollars only, or does that also include leverage dollars that are going to the same address?
It's CDBG dollars only because this is a trigger of the Community Housing and Development Act.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
that's right. Yep, only CDBG dollars.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so Rose says that she was having technical difficulties, but her question has been answered. Thank you. Myrtle asks, does this apply to general contractors or does it also apply to subcontractors? So it applies to all laborers on the project.
Yep, all contractors, all subcontractors.
So Rachel asks the confounding question about, isn't this an oxymoron since we want to pay them a higher rate with Davis-Bacon and now we're seeing if they are still LMI. So that is, I agree, but that is why HUD threw in the or in the past 5 years, because they want to show that we are bringing people on who maybe were at lower wages, but because of our project, they are now out of LMI, but we can still count them as Section 3 because at the time that we hired them, they were Section 3 within the past 5 years. What if an employee does not want to provide the information? This is personal information and they won't want to provide it. Yep, I agree. I have voiced that concern to HUD. Stephen, I think our guidance here is going to be collect their current salary from the contractor. And if that current salary qualifies them, count them as Section 3. If it doesn't, count them as non-Section 3.
Yep, I would agree with that. Just count and get the information you can, and if they don't want to provide it, then just don't count them as Section 3.
Right. I think on that, we just have to do our best, whatever that is.
So Stephen, Tom's asking if we can go over the requirements for when the new rule applies, which kind of projects. Do you want to flip back to that slide? Now, we just tried to look at sort of standard CDBG, current CDBG programs that are being offered. Obviously, new programs, new awards, the applicability is there, but we would have to modify. I think he means the slide that has like downtown revitalization, upper story housing.
So actually, it was the one you were just on.
Oh, sorry, Tom. This
So
one?
yeah, that bottom part.
Oh, the timing. Gotcha. So we'll be perfectly honest, if HUD were to ask you this question, they would say it should apply at the time that the new rule was published, which is December of 2020. We feel like this is a huge change and it has taken us a long time to get to this point. So we're using July 1 for projects that we award after that date and for projects that go out for construction. I know that's a little tricky because you're all thinking we can't go out to construction if we don't have an award. But right now we're shouldering some disaster recovery projects that are also federally funded, and we're matching those funds. So some of those have construction contracts that are pre-July, but our award will be post-July. So that's why we had to get kind of in the weeds with all 3 of those things being true for us to require compliance from you all and the projects that you're performing.
So then the watershed project, it would not apply to that.
Correct. From IEDA's policy perspective.
Well, that at least is good news. Thank you.
Don't tell HUD that. Oh, this is recorded. I shouldn't say that.
Yeah, we can't post this now.
I gotta edit this.
We'll have Jason edit it before he puts it on the website.
All right, so it looks like I'm trying to go back up through questions. If a contractor has 40 employees, but only 8 are working on the CDBG project, or if they after the project starts, but weren't listed on the contractors list originally. Stephen, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the rule, requires total labor hours. So if there's been a change in who's going to be working on the project, that change should be communicated and done accordingly.
Yep, so just the contractor just needs to provide who's working on the project, and if they add people or shift people, they would just notify you. And the spreadsheet that Stephen's developed, I think, has weekly, but we're pretty flexible depending on how folks are paid or what's the easiest for you. So as long as the hours worked on the project are getting collected on that spreadsheet, you can add new people as long as they have correlating paperwork.
Yeah, that's right. And you can use the form for weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or however the wages are being collected or hours being collected.
So Diana asks, if we don't meet the 25%, what happens? We're still working on that. As Stephen said, HUD requires those qualitative efforts to be documented. We're still trying to figure out if that is best achieved at the local level or the state level. Technically, what happens is that as we go into the HUD database to close out a project, we have to enter the total number of labor hours and the Section 3 and targeted Section 3 hours. And then it says you didn't meet it, click which of these things you did. And so we're still trying to figure out, how best to accomplish that, because we just don't know at this time how frequent that occurrence is going to be. I think based on the old Section 3 process, we would say we will never meet it, but it's all so new that we don't know what our percentages will look like at this time. We will help you guys work through that when these projects come to close out. Jennifer, I assume that comment was on watersheds. Thank you all for the comments. I know that it's frustrating and hard. We're doing our best to convey compliance in the easiest way we can. So contractors that are just themselves will just have to fill it out for themselves. I mean, hours are tracked and income is income, so we just work it out. Yeah, increase the threshold. I agree with that. I mean, obviously, we are prohibited from lobbying, but you're welcome to voice opinions as you see fit. Oh, Joyce, that's a great question. Since this is not required for owner-occupied single-family rehab, do rehab programs no longer need to put old Section 3 language in their contracts? I believe the answer to that is yes. We will be, as Nicole said, we're working on management guide and policies and procedures updates for Section 3, but I believe that all of the bidding and clause language will only be required when an activity triggers Section 3 compliance. Nicole, do you agree? Nicole might have had to leave the call. Stephen, do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
So maybe that's good news for housing rehab folks. It'll make the publishing of your bidding smaller, less cumbersome. Myrtle asks, is the 25% requirement project-wide or per contractor? So it is project-wide. And something that is inconsistent between the rule and HUD's system is that, as you guys all know, the Section 3 has always been something that we've had to report annually. So no matter when your project was awarded or concluded, we had an annual process through Iowa Grants to report to HUD. The new rule continues that annual language, but the tools that they have created are based on activity completion. So it's likely that we will be reporting this information to HUD when an activity is being closed, both in Iowa Grants and in our HUD reporting system. So we will be collecting the total labor hours and the total Section 3 targeted Section 3 at the end of a project. So it is project-wide. All right, well, I think we're coming up on an hour. We allowed 90 minutes for this session. I think we've covered most of the questions, but again, feel free to type into the chat or raise your hand if you have more. And then again, Stephen's contact information was on the intro slide. He will be our point person for all Section 3 questions. And then our intent again is to publish this training and workshop with the slides, and then get out our updated management and policy guide as soon as possible. All right, Stephen, I don't see any more comments. Do you have anything else to share?
No, I think that covers pretty much everything. But I think we do appreciate your guys' time today and hearing about this new rule change, and we look forward to working with you all as we unveil it and figure it all out together. Anything else, Ann?
No, I think that's good. Brad asked if we could put together a qualitative compliance effort at the annual CDBG workshop to help with compliance. And I think that's a good suggestion. So we'll take all these chats and make sure that we take note of these comments. But yes, the qualitative compliance is something that we're still working on. All right, thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Stephen, thank you for the presentation, and we will get this posted as soon as possible so you can all watch it over and over again. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.